and it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator for this session, Geraldine Bedell. She is the executive editor at Parent Zone. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing more about SafetyTech. Just a few notes of housekeeping though. Please do ask questions in the Q&A box. And please do also ask questions on Twitter. The hashtag is #CogX2021. Over to you, Geraldine.
Thanks so much, Alice. And welcome everybody to this session on SafetyTech, tackling the toxic web. We're going to be looking in this session at how design thinking can help make the internet a less discriminatory space, and in particular, how it can help tackle gender-based violence online. My name's Geraldine Bedell, as Alice said, and I'm executive editor at Parent Zone and co-presenter of the Tech Shop podcast. I'm delighted to be joined by Azmina Dhrodia, who is Senior Policy Manager, Gender and Data Rights at the Webb Foundation, and by Charlotte Webb, co-founder of Feminist Internet. The format is that I'll be moderating a discussion between Azmina and Charlotte about a project in which they've both been involved, the Tech Policy Design Lab, which set out to use design thinking to co-create solutions to online abuse and harassment of girls and women. While we're talking, please do send in questions for Azmina and Charlotte, and we'll do our best to answer them as we go through. The background to this is that the internet has a sexism problem. It's very hard to be a female politician, journalist, or public figure of any kind online. And sexism isn't only an issue that affects prominent people. Last week, Ofsted published a report in which they revealed that 9 out of 10 girls in some schools had received unsolicited sexual images online. So it's a deep-rooted problem, it's a systemic problem, it's an extensive problem, and it's an intersectional problem. And you don't have to experience it directly for it to affect you. Hostility to women online can and does deter participation. We know that there aren't enough women in STEM, but even when women do work in tech, they often find the conditions very difficult. So Azmina, I'm going to hand over to you first to talk about what you've been trying to do with the Tech Policy Design Lab and how you see design thinking having the power to unlock solutions to gender-based discrimination online, which is so pervasive.
Great, thanks so much, Geraldine. And before we jump into sort of the process and what we've been up to, I wanted to just speak very quickly about what we do at the Webb Foundation, as well as how we frame this issue of online gender-based violence. So for those of you that don't know, the Webb Foundation was co-founded in 2009 by Sir Tim Berners-Lee and Rosemary Leith. As many of you will know, Tim Berners-Lee is the inventor of the World Wide Web, and our mission is to ensure that the web is an accessible place and open to all, and that when folks are online, that it's safe and empowering for everyone equally. In terms of how we talk about the issue of online gender-based violence, I know you touched upon this a little bit in your introduction, Geraldine, but I thought I'd just dive into it a little bit more. At the Webb Foundation, we use the terminology online gender-based violence and abuse. Others refer to it as violence and abuse against women online, or tech or ICT facilitated violence. Others will call it online harassment, cyber trolling. But I think sometimes all of these different terminologies can be confusing. But in essence, what we are all talking about are the different tactics and harms that are perpetrated against women and non-binary folks online that are rooted in harmful power structures. And as you mentioned, online gender-based violence is both systemic and intersectional. So by systemic, I mean that this is an extension and a manifestation of existing forms of discrimination and abuse against women. This is not a new phenomena. Sadly, women, have experienced discrimination and violence in all forms of their life for eons. But what is new now is the medium through which we're seeing it play out online. And by intersectional, we mean that women who have multiple and intersecting identities, so women of color, women from different ethnic minorities, young women, LGBT women, etc., are at heightened risk of abuse and disproportionately affected because the abuse so often targets their different identities. And there's many different tactics that online gender-based violence can include. And, just to share a small few, sadly, there's many more than the list I'll provide, but it can include misogynistic and racist comments against an individual. It can include privacy concerns, such as non-consensual intimate image sharing, and also threats of physical and sexual violence. And so in terms of the project and the Tech Policy Design Lab, the project contained 4 different aspects. So the first was a series of 4 multi-stakeholder consultations that the Webb Foundation convened between March 2020 and February 2021. And that really focused on gathering evidence around the specific experiences of online abuse for different groups of women. So this included different consultations on women's rights activists, women in public life, which included journalists and politicians, and young women as well. And then second was that we convened a series of 3 design thinking workshops. And similarly, we brought together a multi-stakeholder, different stakeholders. So we had tech company representatives, we had civil society organizations, we had regulators and research and other experts in online abuse who all came together to co-create product solutions for online gender-based violence. And based on the evidence built out through our consultations and other desk research, we focused on the abuse that we see in the comments and replies of highly visible women online. So, that could be journalists or politicians, but even someone whose post has gone viral. And then within this, we focused on 2 main themes. So the first theme was about curation, which is really about how to give women greater control over who can see or comment or reply to their posts, and more choice over what they see online. And then the second theme was around reporting, because when curation doesn't work, the main recourse women have when they experience abuse on the platform is to report it to those platforms. And I'm sure, as we'll unpack later, what was central to our approach and analysis has been to recognize the intersectional nature of online gender-based violence. And our approach didn't just consider the experiences of women from marginalized communities, but it centers them, because we know that if we can solve this problem for this group of women, then ideally we can create a safer, online experience for everyone. And then lastly, we held a roundtable following the workshops, where we brought back a small group of key stakeholders to further unpack the product solutions and the prototypes that we co-created. And then in terms of what this is all leading up to, this is all leading up to the UN Generation Equality Forum that's being held in Paris later this month, where we're calling on the world's largest tech platforms, so Facebook, Instagram, Google, YouTube, Twitter, and TikTok, to announce a bold package of commitments related to the solutions that we came up with during our workshops and to tackle gender inequality online. So in total, we had 120 participants from 35 countries involved in this 14-month process, which really shows how truly multi-stakeholder, this entire process is. As you mentioned, these workshops are the pilot of our the Webb Foundation's Tech Policy Design Lab, which really is aiming to bridge the gap between technologists, policymakers, researchers, and those who use online services. And it aims to apply the right mix of expertise and experiences to create effective and workable product and policy solutions to target some of the biggest technology challenges of our time. And really excited that we were able to focus on online gender-based violence and harassment against women as the first thematic focus.
Thanks so much, Azmina. Can I bring in Charlotte to tell us something about the design thinking process? What did it entail in practice, and where did it take you?
Thank you, Geraldine, and thank you for that brilliant framing and introduction, Azmina. So I'll talk a bit about some of the elements that went into creating the workshops, and then I'll talk about what the workshops themselves actually looked like. As Azmina said, the focus was on abuse experience in replies and comments, and thematically we were really focusing on curation and reporting. So one of the elements that was really central and crucial to the workshops was a set of personas. And these personas focused on highly visible women who have intersecting identities. They were developed based on evidence gathered through the consultations, as well as some additional desk research and, of course, extensive knowledge from within the Webb Foundation team. So there were 5 personas in the set. Yvonne, is a Black female politician based in the UK. Muna, an LGBTQ+ activist based in Tunisia. Amy, an Asian American body positivity influencer, really hard phrase to say. Paulina, a university student in Brazil, and Karishma, a freelance journalist based in India. And we'll be making the personas available online, so you'll have a chance to sort of see them fleshed out with illustrations, which give you a better kind of picture than I can do by just describing them. Another really important element of the workshop creation was a set of what we call human problems. These human problems would be things like, I'm under siege by a growing online mob and I need a way to protect myself and stop it, but I don't know how. So these kind of phrases are written in the first person to really ground them in experience. They basically say what is happening for someone and what does that person need. Again, they were kind of created by looking at evidence about people's experiences of abuse, but they're described in a way that allows folks to design solutions from. Obviously, they are not, we're not able to be exhaustive in describing all of the problems that women experience, but we chose a set that would be representative of the concerns of the people coming to the workshops, as well as the organisations. Another key element to the workshop creation was fictional apps. So we basically create fictional apps that workshop groups can imagine designing their solutions within. This is really to focus the outputs on the needs and experiences of users and not the sort of models or existing parameters of specific platforms. So those were the three real kind of backbone elements of the workshops. And then in terms of how they played out, they are run in a sort of 5-stage process. We're really asking people to become designers for the day. They're working in small breakout groups. They're focusing on designing solutions that enable better user experiences around online abuse. So each group ended up creating a user interface and prototyping an actual tangible solution. The first stage of the workshop is around the scenario. So this is really getting people to dig into a combination of a human problem, a persona, and a fictional app, and really discuss amongst themselves what is the experience of the person that we're designing for like, what's their context, how does their identity influence the way that they're experiencing harassment, etc., so that any design work is grounded in kind of placing themselves in the shoes of the person being designed for. And after they've kind of delved into this scenario, we go into an ideation phase, which is very much about generate as many ideas as you possibly can. This involves lots of scribbling on pieces of paper in silence at home. Again, we sort of really encouraging people to ideate grounded in this scenario. And then we ask people, of course, to share their ideas back. They hold up pieces of paper to their screen. The group discusses what's been said, and we sort of select one idea or a combination of ideas to take forward. After an idea has been sort of selected, we go into furious prototyping. People basically mock up 3 or more screens showing the user experience in Miro. We use that to wireframe the prototypes. And then once the prototype has been created, mocked up, we ask people to pitch back the prototype to the bigger group, and we give them quite clear kind of parameters for what that presentation needs to include. So we make sure that we really hear from them what was the kind of scenario they were designing for, how did they frame their prototype in terms of a how might we question, what were the key features of it, what were the benefits of it, what does it look like, and importantly, are there any sort of policy considerations that might need to be made by companies to enable that prototype to come into existence.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, for an absolutely fascinating overview of the process. There's lots, I think, to dig down into there. And Azmina, I wondered if you could come in just to talk a bit more about the personas and the challenges in creating those personas, because what strikes me is that we're talking about such an extensive range of issues. I wondered, first of all, why you chose prominent women, and I wondered why also how you got those personas to capture the range of harms that we're seeing.
Yeah, no, so it was a really interesting process in terms of why we chose highly visible women. That was mainly because the consultations that we had and the evidence and the data that we had was particularly around women who are in, you know, the public eye, whether that is activists or politicians and journalists. And we, you know, as I mentioned, we really felt that if we're able to solve the problems for this group of women who are highly visible and have, you know, marginalized and intersecting identities, then ideally these solutions that we co-create will work, you know, more widely for everyone out there using these platforms. In terms of the actual personas, it was a really challenging process because we wanted to really reflect a variety of women and their identities, and we had so much evidence, not only from our own consultations, but, you know, from all of the amazing research that's been done by, you know, different civil society organizations out there as well. And so how do you boil that down into particular people, but also in a way, you know, to be frank, that isn't tokenistic and just looks like a tick box exercise. And so that's why we wanted to make these, you know, authentic, but also reflective of the lived experiences of so many of the women that, you know, attended our consultations, or the groups that, you know, represented those women. And, you know, what we were interested in is really making sure, as I mentioned, that we highlighted women who experience these multiple axes of discrimination. You know, and I think even though activists and journalists and politicians may have broadly similar experiences of abuse online, this is still quite nuanced in regards to their roles and their different their different professions. And, you know, one of the things that we wanted to highlight was that abuse is, you know, so often, as you mentioned, a silencing or censoring function. But you know, if you are a highly visible woman and you're dependent on social media platforms to, you know, for your job, the option to log off isn't there. I don't believe it should be an option, because, you know, women have the right to, you know, freely express themselves on this platform. But so often women are told to, you know, limit their interactions or get offline. But, you know, when you're a highly visible woman in particular, the economic cost of getting online is often too great. It's not even an option. So we really wanted to build this consideration into our personas, you know, and in terms of, you know, we really wanted to tap into influencers as well, because so often we talk about journalists and politicians and activists, but influencers are very much women who are, you know, in public life, albeit perhaps in different ways. But especially when you're an influencer talking about, you know, women's rights issues or around misogyny, you know, they'll very much, you know, are just as likely, it seems, to receive abuse for speaking out, because of, you know, they are, you know, because of sort of harmful gender stereotypes against women. And we also lastly wanted to design for women who get thrown into the public eye but didn't necessarily plan for it. So as Charlotte mentioned, one of our personas was about a young woman, a young university student who went viral. And I think the whole point is that anyone can become a woman in public life, and there's different levels of understanding and support that is needed, and you know, for different folks who are thrown into the spotlight. You know, for someone like that who goes viral versus a woman in a profession where perhaps when you sadly are entering politics or journalism or activism, the risks are slightly more known. Yeah, so I don't know, Charlotte, if you wanted to come in around the illustrations piece, because I know that was something that you led on.
Yeah, sure. I mean, as Azmina hinted, it was a really challenging process, finding that balance between wanting to be as representative as we could of people's lived experiences, but then also being very aware of your own positionality, not wanting to ventriloquize anybody, wanting to be very respectful of those experiences, especially if they haven't been experiences that you personally have had. So lots of sort of sensitive navigation was required. We did want to make sure that the personas were visually represented in some way. It felt like using photographic images was very problematic from from lots of different perspectives, actually. Partly issues of representation, partly issues of sort of ownership of images, not wanting to be too directly representative of any one person. So we decided to take an illustration approach and bring together composite images that would capture some of the really important aspects of women's identities without sort of revealing anything about a particular woman. So that was where we arrived. But yeah, a challenging process for sure.
Could I ask one of you to talk about why you decided to use fictional apps? Because I think you did have tech companies involved. And, you know, we all know where the abuse is at its most egregious. So why the fictional apps?
Yeah, so fictional apps kind of do afford a little bit more creative freedom than grounding the design process in, real apps. They give people a bit more space to experiment, and also, in terms of the group, help us avoid any one person being the authority on a particular app. So sort of avoiding what's known about existing real platforms, getting in the way of thinking about what might be a possibility. So it's trying to find a balance between grounding the making in a real situation rather than a sort of abstract proposition, but also not shutting down the creative possibilities by, burdening people with what they already know. I mean, there's obvious similarities between the fictional apps and the real apps. When you see them, you'll recognize that Micro looks very much like Twitter, for example. And that was important because we wanted it to be realistic. But as I say, just afford a bit more, lateral thinking, as it were, in the design process.
Great. And so we've talked about the process. Can we talk a little bit about how successful it was? Did you manage to bring those things, the personas, the human problems that they faced, and then the apps together successfully? What were the challenges there, Azmina?
Yeah, no, I think we were able to do that, and it was really challenging in the sense of sometimes different experiences and different personas didn't always fit as neatly into a specific app as perhaps we would like. And I think some of the challenges as well were that sometimes the experiences of the personas were completely different to the app. So in terms of experiencing some of the platforms are video and image based platforms versus using the written word and posts in terms of their comments and replies. So it was really challenging, but also really interesting. Sort of we did so many movements on Miro to try and match and look at all the different ways and all the different interactions and how they could come together to form that sort of ideal scenario that we could co-create solutions for. And I think it was really in somewhere a lot more easier to connect than others. So we had Yvonne, who is the Black politician from the UK, the Black female politician, experiencing pylons of abuse, and it was really interesting in terms of the outcomes and the solutions that were co-created for someone like Yvonne, where a lot of the co-created solutions were around more curation and being able to have more sort of support in terms of what you can see online and how you can block or mute or limit replies or time your interactions. Whereas when we had a similar experience for Amy, who was the Asian American body positivity influencer, and who also received a pylon of abuse on a different app, a lot of the solutions that came about were much more about community creation and community support, and how the influencers who have these strong followers can actually come in and help with that curation. So what was interesting is that we had these human problems that sometimes were quite similar in nature, but when you put them on a different platform, the solutions that came out were different. But I think the best part about it is that in all of these sort of combinations, the solutions that came out could work and be useful for all of these different women that we were designing these solutions for. So having community support when you're a politician or journalist is just as useful as when you're an influencer. But it's interesting that didn't necessarily come out as strongly as it did when we talked about an influencer. And same about being able to have more control over who can reply and comment on your posts. That's just as helpful for someone that goes viral or is an influencer as it is for a politician and journalist. So I think it was tricky to make sure that we were covering all of our bases and making sure that the experiences were in line with the actual functionality, the core functionalities of each app. But in the end, I think we got to a really concrete set of ideas and prototypes of how can we actually improve women's experiences online.
Great. And Charlotte, could you tell us a bit about what those ideas were? Because you talked about the ideation, and I got the impression that lots and lots of ideas came out, but maybe they coalesced around a couple of themes. Is that right?
Yeah, well, I mean, we were focusing, as Mina mentioned already, on sort of curation and on reporting. So quite a lot of the prototypes that emerged fit nicely into those themes. So where prototypes were focusing more on curation, it might be things like ensuring that people have more granular controls over what they can see, when they see it, etc. Whereas when they were in kind of ideating around reporting, again, like cued by the scenario, ideas emerged around, for example, reporting dashboards or reporting hubs, sort of ability to track the reporting process against a clear timeline. So it sort of depended the specific ideas that came out depended on who was being designed for. But there were some really interesting common themes. One thing that emerged, whether they were designing around curation or reporting, was this point that doesn't matter how great a product feature is or a set of safety settings or even policy, if those things aren't accessible within the user experience, or if they're too difficult to understand to be useful, they're kind of redundant. So there was a lot of work around clarifying parts of the process that could be helpful. And one of the very specific features that I loved was a hover over feature that would explain, if you hovered over a drop-down menu that gives you options of the category of abuse that you want to report, you would just have a hover over that explains exactly what is meant by that category. So things, kind of details of the experience that make the whole process of tackling abuse better were things that I felt were really, really successful.
Great. And you had tech companies in the room, I think. And, you know, there is an argument that the tech companies with their attention economies have a vested interest in not making it easier for abuse to be stamped out. Did you find that they were really receptive to these suggestions?
Yeah, no, I think, you know, I think one of the key parts of this process was to make sure that the tech companies involved were part of the process from the very beginning. So we had all 4 tech companies, you know, from the first consultation in March 2020 to the last consultation in February 2021. And then at each workshop, we held 3 of them actually. And they sent different, you know, members of their team, so whether they're from product or the policy side of the company. And I think being part of the process and being transparent and upfront and clear about the goal and the aim, which is that, you know, this whole process is about bringing these different stakeholders together, bringing a wide variety of expertise from within those tech companies, but also the civil society organizations, also independent researchers, academics, you know, regulators and government officials. You know, there's so many people around the world that think about this issue every day, you know, including Charlotte and myself, about how can we make these spaces safer for women. And it's really about tapping into that different set of expertise. You know, but this is not just about the process of the Tech Policy Design Lab, but we were also really clear that at the end of this process, we want them to announce these concrete commitments to truly tackle online gender-based violence, and you know, and create more gender equal spaces in their on their platforms, you know, in which will, you know, those announcements in terms of you know, different companies and different heads of states, they'll be announcing any commitments that they make in just a couple of weeks' time. So, you know, we've been working behind the scenes to make sure that this entire process will lead to concrete commitments by these companies to ensure that, you know, there are tangible, you know, these are tangible solutions that we've proposed. And, you know, a lot of the prototypes that we developed and co-created, you know, we've used as illustrative examples of how they can think through solving the different problems we're asking them to solve for, which, you know, related to our workshops is around curation and reporting. So I think being part of the process was really, really important and really key, and tapping into their in-house expertise as well. You know, there's lots of trust and safety folks and lots of product designers and policy people that work on these issues. So yeah, I think it was, you know, we'll see what comes out at Generation Equality Forum in a couple of weeks' time. But I think that, you know, that really helped make the process work, to have them involved from the beginning and transparent about our objectives.
Yeah, that's really encouraging. And Charlotte, we've talked a little bit about reporting and how that might work better, but could you tell us something too about curation and community support, and how in practice you were able to prototype better ways of doing that?
Yeah, sure. So One of the prototypes that came out of the process was called Calm the Crowd. So that really offers users more granular controls when a spike in unusual activity is detected. So it provides users with data that can help them understand when their account's receiving more attention than usual, so that they can make really informed decisions about how to respond. The group had some suggestions about the kinds of metrics that data could include, like view counts, shares, comments, etc. There was another one called viral notification, which allows you to go into a viral mode. So you can turn off comments or downloads, again, like when content is viewed or shared at scale. So some really interesting ideas about sort of time-specific ability to control your experience. The issue again of sort of like human language and being able to offer tools in a sensitive way rather than a sort of like legalese way was very sort of woven into some of the ideas that people came up with around curation, the ability to do things easily as well, to sort of toggle into a mode in one click was really important. Grouping together settings that you can easily enable or disable. So it's sort of a combination of more granular, but also easier to do at the same time was really, I think, what kind of underpinned the curation work.
That's fascinating. We've had a question in from the audience, from Jack Coopy. Have you been able to have discussions with tech companies regarding the role of anonymity in online abuse and what can be done here? I'm glad this question wasn't to me because I've got really strong feelings about this. Which one of you would like to come in?
I'll come in just to, you owe me one, Charlotte. No, I think this is a tricky question, one that, I think a lot of folks, particularly in the space, are still grappling with. I think on one hand, online anonymity is vital to ensure freedom of expression for everyone online, particularly activists and other marginalized communities who, may not necessarily live in spaces where they can really express themselves based on their, their own identity and how they identify. So there's obviously that how anonymity helps, support freedom of expression online. But I think, we have to be really honest that online abuse, and violence against women thrives in these spaces. And a lot of the time, the threats that they receive or the abuse that they receive comes from anonymous accounts. So how do you balance that equation? I would love to say that I have the answer, but I don't at the moment. But I do think that one of the things that we tackled in this in these workshops, in terms of what Charlotte you were just speaking about curation, is about the idea that just because a lot of stuff exists on this platform, because a lot of content that is abusive or violent in nature exists, it does not necessarily mean that women have to see it and be confronted with it on a daily basis, because we know what the impact of that is. We know that seeing online abuse can lead to self-censorship, it can lead to women leaving these spaces, and that has detrimental impacts on our society and political participation more widely. So how can greater curation and greater control over the types of content that you're seeing online, greater control over not seeing content from certain types of users, whether that's users who don't have a profile photo or users who have a smaller number of followers on their accounts? How can all of these different metrics and different forms of data help women and all users create a safer online experience where that content is not even necessarily there, but it's definitely not front and center in what they're seeing. And I think in terms of having specific conversations around anonymity, we haven't had that yet with tech companies, but we do genuinely believe that greater control and greater curation can help hide and stamp out some of that abuse, and ideally will deter folks from being abusive in the first place if they know that they're just typing in comments that no one's ever going to see. Ideally one would hope that they get bored of it after a while, but I think what the key objective for us was to ensure that when women use these spaces and when women use these platforms that they're so reliant on and that we so desperately need them to stay on, that the abuse and the violence is not something that they're bombarded with and expected to just sift through as part of their daily lived experience of being as being a woman online.
Thank you, Azmina. I apologise to the real author of that question. It wasn't, in fact, Jack. Do you want to come in on that, Charlotte? Or
yeah,
would you?
The thing, what I love about this question is that I think it helps us just reinforce the point that really considering contextual specificity when we're designing solutions is vital, because we can see clearly, as Azmina's explained, what anonymity means and what it affords to an individual really depends on who they are and where they are and what their behaviors are and what their motivations are. Sometimes it's extremely important, sometimes it's a source of abuse. So for me, those kinds of difficult problems lend themselves well to the kind of approach that we've brought to this project, because when you dig in really in detail about, well, what does it mean for this person in this context versus this person in this context, you have a really interesting and fruitful sort of entry point into tackling it, I think.
Yeah. So we're getting towards the end of the conversation. So what would be really interesting, I think, is to find out from you what you think will happen next. You talked about the UN Generation Equality Forum in Paris. What do you hope to see there?
Yeah, so ideally we'll have all 4 of the companies that attended these workshops and our consultations announced, a bold package of commitments to tackle online gender-based violence and abuse. Some of the things that we're asking companies to solve for is we asked them to solve for a set of problems and to make their commitments around the key issues and themes that were explored in our workshop, with the acknowledgement that obviously curation and reporting is not an exhaustive set of problems that they need to solve for when tackling the issue of online gender-based violence, but it's a start, and it's a big start, and it has, if these problems are solved for and considered, then it can have a real impact on how women use these spaces and create these safer online experiences. And what we did is we really went back and reflected upon all of the different thoughts, solutions, prototypes that came out across all of these workshops and our roundtable. And what we're doing is asking companies to first build better ways for women to curate their safety online, and asking them to do this by considering some of the key themes that were brought out in our workshops. So offering more granular settings, so that's again who can see or share or comment or reply to posts, using more simple and accessible language throughout the user experience, providing easy navigation and access. Accessibility, as Charlotte mentioned, came out loads. We don't want for greater curation tools to only be available when you go down 14 clicks in the settings page. It needs to be something that people know about and can easily access. And then the other thing we're asking them to do is reduce the burden on women by proactively reducing the amount of abuse that they see. And then in terms of reporting, we're asking companies to improve the reporting systems by again tapping into what came out in our workshops, giving users the ability to track and manage their reports. If we're able to track and manage the food delivery when you order from Deliveroo or Uber Eats, ideally we'll be able to track a report of abuse and see at what stage it's at on each of these platforms. Going back to what Charlotte had just mentioned in terms of really looking at the specific experiences of people who experience abuse, we need platforms to give greater capacity to users to address context and language. This is so important when you're not an English speaker or some of the sort of French or Arabic or people who speak other languages or local dialects. It's so important for them to be able to add context and be able to talk about their experience of abuse and report it in their local language. We also, as Charlotte mentioned, want companies to provide more policy and product guidance when reporting abuse. So making sure that when you're reporting abuse, that you're reporting against a specific category of conduct on their platform that isn't allowed, and that you're crystal clear about what that means and what they mean, so that when you make that report, that there's a better chance of it having a more effective and adequate outcome. And then, again, a lot of this is about reducing the burden on women. So establishing additional ways for women to access help and support during the reporting process, whether that's from a trusted contact or, outreach to a civil society organization that's working on this issue and can provide support and services. But, I think the approach to this has been recognizing that every platform works differently, has different technical constraints. So we're trying not to be overly prescriptive in what exactly, these solutions can be, but we're asking for them to solve a set of problems, and within that use these prototypes that we have developed as sort of inspiration and illustrative examples of what those solutions could look like.
Thank you. We have got one question, which I think we've got time to answer. If Charlotte, you wanted to come in. So I think it's from Rachel Brock, although I can't guarantee anymore. She says some of the proposed solutions engage with avoidance of negative interactions. In your projects, did you see any evidence of a particularly gendered trend towards self-censorship online to avoid abuse? And we know that happens, I guess. Charlotte, do you have anything you'd like to come in with there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would say yes, there's plenty of evidence that that happens. I mean, that came out not only in the consultation evidence, but in research over, the last number of years, including the Toxic Twitter report, which Azmina wrote, back in, I don't know, what year was it, Azmina, 2017?
2018, yeah.
Yeah, so definitely yes. I mean, actually, one of the personas tried to describe a kind of internal pull but that the target of abuse felt between, on the one hand, wanting to just leave the platform because the abuse was really bad, but on the other hand, feeling very loyal to the followers that she had, who are very supportive and give lots of positive comments and replies as well. So yes, definitely. And we tried to kind of get into the nuances of what it feels like to be in that kind of bind position.
Great. And Azmina, yeah, do jump in.
Yeah, no, I think, thanks, Charlotte. Just in terms of in my previous role, my previous hat on when I worked at Amnesty International, I led quite a bit of research looking into the silencing and censoring impact of online abuse. And I remember this was back in 2017 now, so I don't know if it's gotten any better, to be honest, hopefully, but back in 2017, we ran a poll with Ipsos Mori looking into women's experiences of abuse and harassment in 9 countries. And one of those countries was the UK. And I think it was abuse and harassment on social media platforms. And I think about 23% or 24% of women in the UK had experienced abuse or harassment on these platforms. And what was striking was that overall across these 9 countries, of the women who experienced abuse or harassment, 78% made some changes to the way that they use these platforms as a result. And 33% had said that they directly changed the type of content that they post online as a result of experiencing this harassment. So I think those stats, and there's been so many reports and since then as well, really underscore just how much this abuse impacts a woman's ability to express herself freely online, and how much women have to think once, twice, 3 times, 10 times before they post online, because of the idea that they know that what they're saying might perhaps trigger a backlash and trigger abuse. And again, going back to what came out in our consultations and other evidence, we know that when you're a journalist or a politician and your job is to be in the public eye, your job is to be in the public square, and that so many of these platforms are the new town squares, that when they do express how they feel, that is something that they constantly have to be prepared for, and that is utterly exhausting. And that shouldn't be the norm for how these women use these spaces. But sadly it is, and we've seen so many women leave online spaces because of the abuse that they receive, and because of the inadequate or inconsistent support from platforms. So we do hope that some of the solutions that we've come up with and some of the things that we're calling for tech companies can help improve those experiences, whether it's around the type of content they see online, or ensuring that when they do experience abuse and report it, that there's a more effective response.
Well, that's quite a depressing thought, really. But it is very encouraging that through your project, you've been able to come up with so many potential exciting innovations, which could really make a difference. So I think probably we're at the end of our time, and it remains for me only to thank Azmina and Charlotte for an absolutely fantastic conversation, which I felt really helpful and fascinating, and I'm sure the audience has too. And thank you to the audience too for being here.